Midnight, the Forgotten Mountain Man. The Appalachian who survived for decades without being seen. Deep within West Virginia's isolated hollows, where ancient trees cling to fog and civilization feels like a distant memory, a family existed that the world had forgotten. This is the story of the Whitakers of Odd, a bloodline so twisted by generations of intermarriage that their very existence challenged everything we understand about human survival. 029, it was the year 1978 when social worker Barbara Chandler first received reports of a family living in complete isolation in the remote Appalachian Mountains. The reports were vague, almost mythical. In hushed tones, local residents spoke of people who rarely left their property, who communicated in sounds rather than words, and whose physical appearance suggested something deeply wrong had occurred over many generations. 101, for 15 years, Barbara had worked in rural West Virginia, yet nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover. From Charleston, the drive to Odd took 3 hours, winding through narrow mountain roads where cell phone signals disappeared and road signs became scarce. The community itself consisted of scattered homes hidden among dense forests, connected by dirt paths that turned to thick mud when it rained. 128, up the final hill, Barbara's car struggled, wheels spinning against loose gravel, until she reached a clearing. There, a weathered house stood like a sentinel against the grey November sky. The Whitaker home was a patchwork of wooden planks and corrugated metal, additions built over decades without any apparent plan. 150, from a crooked chimney, smoke rose, and several dogs barked frantically as Barbara approached. The air carried the smell of wood, smoke and decay, a combination that would become forever etched in her memory. On the sagging porch stood a woman in her 60s, her face deeply lined, watching Barbara with suspicious eyes that had seen too many outsiders asking too many questions. Mrs. 217, Whitaker, Barbara called out, maintaining a respectful distance. I'm Barbara Chandler, with the County Social Services. I received some concerns about your family and wanted to check if you needed any assistance. The woman said nothing, just continued staring. Behind her, movement caught Barbara's attention. 239, from the shadows of the doorway, a man emerged, his appearance immediately striking. His head was misshapen, larger on one side than the other, and his eyes didn't focus on the same point. He made sounds that resembled language but formed no recognizable words. This was Ray Whitaker, 53 years old, the product of at least 4 generations of uncle-niece and first-cousin unions. 304, her professional training kicked in, suppressing Barbara's initial shock. She had read about the effects of close family breeding in textbooks, seen photographs in medical journals, but encountering it in person was entirely different. Across Ray's face and body, the genetic consequences were written in ways that spoke of profound biological damage. 327, his movements were uncoordinated. His attempts at communication were frustrated and confused. Yet in his eyes, Barbara saw something that would haunt her for years: awareness. He knew he was different. He understood that something fundamental was wrong. He don't talk right, the older woman finally spoke, her voice rough from years of tobacco and mountain living. 352, none of them do. Been that way long as I remember. You going to take them away? Defiance was in her question, but also something else, resignation perhaps, or maybe an exhausted acceptance of a fate she had long stopped fighting. Slowly, Barbara shook her head. I'm here to help, not to take anyone away. 414, can we talk? I'd like to understand your situation better. What unfolded over the next several hours would reveal one of the most extreme cases of familial inbreeding documented in modern American history. The Whitaker family tree wasn't a tree at all, but rather a tightly wound circle that looped back on itself generation after generation. 438, brothers had children with sisters, uncles with nieces, first cousins with first cousins. The practice had started innocently enough in the early 1800s when the first Whitakers settled in these remote mountains, isolated by geography and circumstance. A nightmare of repeating names and impossible connections was the Whitaker genealogy. 519, 4 weeks at the county records office, Barbara spent time piecing together birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census data that painted a picture of systematic genetic catastrophe. The pattern began with Elijah Whitaker, who arrived in what would become Odd, West Virginia, in 1821. He married his first cousin, Sarah Whittaker, in a union that was not uncommon for the time in isolated frontier communities. 549, their 6 children married within the extended family, a practice that continued with each successive generation. By the 1880s, the family was completely isolated, their gene pool reduced to a handful of individuals passing the same genetic material back and forth like a deadly game. When they existed at all, medical records documented a steady increase in cognitive disabilities, physical deformities, and early deaths. 617, the mountains that had once offered the Whittakers freedom and independence had become their prison, trapping them in a cycle of genetic degradation. The family Barbara encountered in 1978 included 12 living members spread across 3 generations, though determining exact relationships was nearly impossible. 641, Ray Whittaker, the man she first met, was simultaneously someone's brother, cousin, and nephew, depending on which family line you traced. His sister, Laureen, 60 years old, had slightly better cognitive function, but walked with a severe limp from hip dysplasia that had never been treated. She could speak in simple sentences, enough to explain the family's daily routine of survival. 706, we keep to ourselves, Laureen told Barbara during one of their conversations, sitting on the porch as autumn leaves swirled in the cold wind. Always have. People in town, they look at us funny, call us names, so we stay here. We got the dogs, got the chickens. Ray, he can't do much, but he feeds the animals. 726, makes him feel useful, you know. The youngest members of the family were the most heartbreaking. 2 children, both under 10, showed severe developmental delays and physical abnormalities that suggested the genetic damage was accelerating with each generation. The girl, whom everyone called Betty, though no official birth certificate existed, had crossed eyes that would never properly align and hands with fused fingers. 756, the boy, Junior, couldn't walk unassisted at age 9 and communicated only through grunts and gestures. Barbara's investigation revealed that the children's parents were first cousins who were themselves the products of uncle-niece relationships. The genetic loading, the accumulation of harmful recessive traits, had reached a critical point. 819, medical geneticists Barbara consulted estimated the family's inbreeding coefficient at levels rarely seen outside of laboratory animal studies. The children faced shortened life expectancies, chronic health problems, and cognitive limitations that would prevent them from ever living independently. Beyond the obvious physical manifestations, the tragedy extended. 842, the Whittakers existed in a state of profound social isolation, cut off not just by geography, but by the visible markers of their genetic heritage. School-aged children were kept home, ostensibly because of the difficult mountain roads, but really because their appearance and abilities made them targets for cruel treatment. 904, the family received no regular medical care, no educational services, no connection to the broader community that might have offered support or intervention. Brutal was the winter in the Appalachian Mountains, and the Whittakers faced it with inadequate heating, limited food supplies, and no transportation to reach help if emergencies arose. 927, Barbara began making regular visits, bringing food, blankets, and medical supplies. She connected the family with disability services, though the bureaucratic process moved with frustrating slowness. Each visit revealed new layers to their situation, new evidence of how decades of isolation and intermarriage had created a family unit barely clinging to survival. 953, the historical context of the Whittaker family's situation reflected broader patterns in Appalachian culture. These mountains had always attracted people seeking isolation. Whether fleeing religious persecution, economic hardship, or simply desiring independence from governmental control, the rugged terrain created natural barriers between communities, and families often went generations with minimal outside contact. 1022, in such environments, marrying within the family wasn't seen as taboo, but as a practical necessity. The biological mechanics at work were explained by Dr. Michael Harrison, a geneticist from West Virginia University who became involved with the Whittaker case in 1979. Every human carries recessive genes for various disorders and conditions, he told Barbara during one of their consultations. 1051, in normal populations, the chances of 2 people with the same harmful recessive genes having children together are relatively low. But in situations of repeated inbreeding, those chances skyrocket. With each generation of close familial unions, the genetic diversity decreases and the expression of harmful traits increases exponentially. 1116, the Whitakers represented an extreme endpoint of this process. DNA testing conducted with family permission in the early 1980s revealed genetic similarity between family members that approached levels seen in identical twins. They were, in essence, a closed genetic system recycling the same genetic material across multiple generations with devastating consequences. 1143, the testing also revealed they carried genes for at least a dozen serious genetic disorders, many of which had manifested in varying degrees across family members. Ray Whitaker's condition, which doctors eventually diagnosed as a combination of microcephaly and severe intellectual disability, was directly attributable to the high levels of inbreeding. 1208, his brain had developed abnormally in utero and the skull deformities were the visible external markers of profound internal damage. Yet Ray, despite his limitations, had developed his own ways of communicating and interacting with his environment. He recognized people, showed emotional responses, and maintained daily routines that gave his life structure and meaning. 1233, as the most cognitively capable adult, Laureen carried the burden of the family's survival. She managed what little money came from disability payments, coordinated their subsistence lifestyle, and made decisions about medical care when emergencies arose. The weight of this responsibility was evident in every conversation. 1253, sometimes I think about what might have been, she once told Barbara, her weathered face reflecting decades of hardship. If my parents had married different people, if we'd had a chance to go to school, meet folks from outside, but this is all we know. This is who we are. A complicated relationship with the Whitaker family was maintained by the community of Odd itself. 1319, some residents felt sympathy and occasionally left supplies at the edge of their property. Others preferred to pretend the family didn't exist, uncomfortable with the reality of what generations of isolation and intermarriage had produced. A few openly hostile individuals blamed the Whitakers for bringing shame to the region, as if the family's genetic situation was somehow a moral failing rather than a biological consequence of circumstance. 1348, this moment right now demands something from you. Laureen's words echo through these mountains. We're still human, no matter what we look like. Type that phrase in the comments if you understand that every person, regardless of circumstance, deserves dignity and recognition. The documentation of the Whitaker family's history revealed patterns that extended far beyond a single bloodline. 1418, throughout Appalachian history, numerous families had experienced similar situations, though few reached the extreme levels seen in the Whitakers. Geographic isolation combined with cultural practices created conditions where genetic diversity diminished over time. The Whitakers were exceptional in degree, but not unique in kind. 1442, through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Barbara's work with the family continued. She watched as the older generation passed away, each death reducing the family's size but not breaking the cycle. Ray Whitaker died in 1987 at age 62 from complications of pneumonia, his compromised immune system unable to fight off the infection. His funeral was attended by only family members and Barbara, held in the small clearing behind their house where generations of Whitakers had been buried in unmarked graves. 1517, even grimmer prospects faced the younger generation. Betty, the girl with fused fingers and crossed eyes, developed seizures in her teenage years that medication could only partially control. Junior never gained the ability to walk independently and required constant care that his aging relatives struggled to provide. 1540, so extensive was the genetic damage that medical professionals privately doubted either child would reach adulthood, a prediction that proved tragically accurate when Betty died at 17 from complications related to her multiple conditions. With a mixture of professional interest and ethical discomfort, the scientific community studied the Whitaker family. 1605, the case offered insights into human genetics that couldn't be obtained through any other means. Yet, the human cost was undeniable. In medical journals, research papers were published documenting the specific genetic disorders present in the family and calculating inbreeding coefficients with mathematical precision. But behind every statistic was a person, a life lived in circumstances they never chose and couldn't escape. 1634, enormous obstacles faced efforts to break the cycle. By the 1990s, the remaining Whitakers were all severely impaired to varying degrees, incapable of independent living or making decisions about their own reproduction. Eventually, social services established a more robust support system, including regular medical visits and assistance with daily living activities. 1659, but the damage of generations couldn't be undone, only managed. Debates about public health policy in isolated rural communities were sparked by the broader implications of the Whitaker case. Should governments have intervened earlier to prevent such extreme inbreeding? What role should genetic counseling play in communities where family intermarriage is culturally accepted? How do we balance respect for cultural autonomy with protection of vulnerable individuals? These questions had no easy answers, existing in the 1736 gray zone between individual rights and collective responsibility. The Appalachian Mountains themselves seemed to hold the family in perpetual twilight. With each passing year, the house where they lived deteriorated further, patches layered upon patches, windows covered with plastic sheeting in winter, the porch sagging under the weight of accumulated decades. 1802, yet within those walls, life continued in its own rhythm. The dogs still barked at strangers. The chickens still needed feeding, and the Whitakers persisted, bound together by blood ties so close they had become indistinguishable. By the early 2000s, the Whitaker family had dwindled to just a handful of surviving members. 1827, Laureen, now in her 80s, remained the family's anchor, though her own health was failing. The once vibrant woman who had managed the household for decades moved slowly now, her body worn down by years of hardship and the same genetic load she shared with all her relatives. The family's story, once known only to a few social workers and medical professionals, began attracting wider attention as researchers documented it for posterity. 1855, against the backdrop of a changing America, the final chapter of the Whitaker saga unfolded. The isolation that had defined their existence for nearly 2 centuries was slowly eroding as modern infrastructure reached even the most remote mountain hollows. Road improvements made odd more accessible. Cell phone towers brought communication to areas that had been unreachable for generations. 1923, yet for the Whitakers, these changes came too late to alter the trajectory set in motion long before. Junior, the boy who never learned to walk, died in 2003 at age 24. His death certificate listed multiple causes, a cascade of organ failures traced back to the genetic disorders he inherited. Small was the funeral, attended by the few remaining family members and the social workers who had become fixtures in their lives. He was buried in the family plot. 1953, another name was added to the generations of Whitakers who had lived and died in these mountains, their stories known only to the earth that covered them. The scientific legacy of the Whitaker family contributed to a broader understanding of human genetics and the consequences of population bottlenecks. Their case is referenced in medical textbooks when explaining autosomal recessive disorders and inbreeding depression. 2018, as a teaching tool, geneticists use their family tree, demonstrating how genetic diversity protects populations from the expression of harmful traits. But the human story, the lived experience of individuals trapped in circumstances beyond their control, often got lost in the clinical language of scientific discourse. 2041, now retired, Barbara Chandler reflected on her decades working with the family. What struck me most wasn't the physical manifestations or the genetic complications, she said in a 2010 interview. It was the humanity that persisted despite everything. They loved each other. They cared for one another. They found joy in small things, a sunny day, a good meal, the companionship of their dogs. 2110, yes, their situation was tragic, but they were never just victims or case studies. They were people. In the family home, the last surviving Whitakers continued to live, though now with regular support from social services and medical professionals. The cycle of intermarriage has finally ended not through intervention, but through natural demographic decline. 2136, there are no more generations to come. No more children will inherit the accumulated genetic damage of their ancestors. The Whittaker bloodline, in its unique and troubled form, is reaching its conclusion. Beyond genetics and public health, the broader lessons from their story resonate. The Whittakers represent what happens when isolation, whether geographic, social, or cultural, becomes absolute. 2205, they demonstrate how quickly genetic diversity can collapse in small populations, and how difficult it is to reverse that collapse once it begins. Their experience reminds us that the freedom and independence celebrated in American frontier mythology came with hidden costs, consequences that might not manifest for generations but were no less real. 2228, largely unchanged remain the mountains that witnessed the Whittaker family's entire history. The same steep slopes, the same dense forests, the same isolated hollows where families carved out lives in defiance of the terrain's challenges. But the human landscape has shifted. The extreme isolation that made the Whittaker situation possible is increasingly rare. 2254, roads connect communities that were once days apart. Modern communication erases distance in ways previous generations couldn't imagine, and genetic knowledge provides tools to prevent the kind of catastrophic inbreeding that defined the Whittaker legacy. **** If you've watched until now, it's because this story moved you. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. ***. 2324, ***, and if this story impacted you, if it made you think about the hidden costs of isolation and the importance of genetic diversity, hit that like button. Share this video with others who need to understand that behind every genetic statistic is a human story deserving of recognition and respect. Subscribe to this channel for more untold histories that reveal the complicated truths hidden in America's isolated corners. ***. 2350, the Forgotten Mountain Man. The Appalachian who survived decades without being seen. This is their story, told not to sensationalize suffering, but to remember that they existed, that they mattered, and that their experience teaches us something essential about human resilience, the consequences of isolation, and the fundamental importance of connection to the broader human family.